any earthly work of art, no matter how good it is merely the unrealized form of something better that we are aspiring to hear and see in heaven. And so that is how we need to view our very favorite works of art, as things that are not yet as good as they ought to be. And our very favorite traditions are things that are not yet taken to the place where they are going.
All right, everybody. I know it's been a while. Apologize, but life sometimes kicks in, and I'm not a full-time YouTuber. So, but today I have with me Daniel Mitsui. He is a professional artist, takes a lot of inspiration from medieval art, specifically religious imagery. And if you're interested in checking out his work, you can go to his website at www.danielmitsui.com. And I will also have the website linked in the description below if you're interested after the conversation too. I first came across Dan's work on Instagram. I would consider myself a medievalist, big fan of medieval work. So when I saw it and he was also Catholic, I had to connect and kind of have this discussion with him. And then fun fact, we had this discussion about 2-3 years ago, and then something happened with the Zoom recording and it was lost, but here we are again. So fresh start with this, but thank you for coming on, Daniel.
Thank you for having me again.
So Daniel, to get started, I guess, can you kind of define for us what is medieval art, and also just like within a historical context, I guess, what years it kind of covers, if you...
Right. Well, the term medieval is used in different ways by different people, and so I will tell you what it means to me. Generally, people use medieval to mean from the fall of the Roman Empire through around 1500 or so. And this is in a European context. It only really makes sense as a label in the context of, European history. As a religious artist, when I think of medieval Christian art, I would think of that as the art that expresses the thought and worship of traditional Christianity freely expressed. And when I say freely expressed, I mean kind of from the time of the conversion of Constantine and the legalization of Christianity in the Roman Empire. Because before then, you obviously have traditional Christian art, but because it's a religion that's persecuted and practiced clandestinely, you can't really look at the surviving examples of art there and say, this is artists expressing themselves exactly as they wanted to, because you have to ask yourself, is some of this being, are they holding back or concealing things in part to just because of their situation? And so I would think that a good starting point for medieval Christian art would be the generation of Constantine and the beginning of the construction of monumental basilicas in the Holy Land under the patronage of, Saint Helena at that same time, and would go through to a point in which different intellectual and theological currents and philosophical currents sort of entered into the mix, ones that caused people to look with a more critical eye on their inherited tradition. And that can be a different thing in different places. In some places, like I'd say in Italy, that happens through the influence of humanist thought and what most people would call the Renaissance, which I think enters into visual art around 1400 or so. In other places, that would be through Protestantism, which obviously starts in the early 16th century. And I think in certain, say, Northern European countries that did not have a large Protestant influence, you would probably say that the last you could consider medieval art would be mid-16th century, really with the Council of Trent, because at that point, the desire to counteract Protestantism sort of becomes a major concern with the manner in which the Catholic Church patronizes the arts, more so than simply the upholding of the traditions. And so I would stretch it really all the way until parts of the 16th century, but that's going to depend a bit on the on where you are. And it's also not going to happen across every medium at the same time. That's an important thing to remember, because I think certain things that you could call Renaissance or humanist happen in literature fairly early on, the generation of, like, say, Petrarch or Boccaccio, but I don't think they really have a profound effect in visual arts until later, and not in music until much later than that. So it depends a bit on medium and on location.
So, an interesting thing is also, this discussion can go for hours, because there's like a lot of definitions that have changed also out of time, even if you try to define what is art, right? So I feel like during the medieval period, especially early on, when you see a lot of in the scrolls and a lot of documentation, when you see like the floral borders around certain readings or scrolls and things like that, or you have like these funny characters, like these little rabbits at the end or something like that, that's kind of sometimes what I think about medieval art. But it seems like during that period that art was almost an expression in the same way that we view language. Like, it was an extension of writing in a way. So it was a way to create a visual that was hard to describe. And that's why you have a lot of imagery of something like, you can have Prudence displayed as a man. So you sometimes have these representation of Prudence in like a chariot or something like that, and it's a man, and it's to showcase kind of like a deeper truth that's hard to explain through words, and it's seen visually. And so is that kind of how you would see it too, at least at the start, as more almost of a language than like some kind of visual entertainment that we view art as today?
Well, I think that you could describe art of this era as having a language, because it communicates in a very disciplined way. I think it has a vocabulary of established symbols and a grammar, which is sort of the way in which they are arranged and composed in order to communicate certain truths. Now, there are a lot of different aspects to this, and we're talking about more than 1,000 years of art history, and so it's a little difficult to generalize. I would say that some of the things you're mentioning there, like the manuscript drolleries, the sort of comical marginal things, actually have a more of a mnemonic purpose than a symbolic one, which I can talk about a little later, but that would be it's probably the wrong time to make that digression. I would say that what I would how I would generalize medieval art over that very long period of time, I'd say that it has two characteristics. One of which is that it is traditional, meaning that it has a sense of veneration for what came before it, and a belief that artists are not really free to make things up ex nihilo, not free to introduce new ideas and concepts that were simply foreign or to what came before them. They're thinking of this as something that was inherited. And the second is the impulse to make things as beautiful as possible. I like to say that I don't think that Christian art has a geographic or chronological center. I don't look and say, oh well, the art of the 13th century, that's the best it ever was, and we should always just imitate that. I don't really think of these traditions as sort of like as having been completed or having been finished or having been brought to their most perfect form. I think that they are things that are as meaningful today as they ever were, and that's what interests me in them. That's what interests me in my work. I'm not trying to be a historical reenactor. I'm trying to continue something that I still think of as vital. And so instead of thinking of it as having like a center or I think of it as having sort of like I'd say two foci, kind of like an elliptical orbit, and that correspond to tradition and beauty. And I would define those as being, the foot of the cross and the Garden of Eden, is how I've put it in one of my lectures.
So, it's the thing about, so the tricky thing sometimes to mention in discussion of this is that with the progression of time from that age to like now, has been so much separating from tradition in order to like almost over individualize ourselves as like this separate unique entity from everybody else, that or you can kind of see it as like the Cartesian kind of mindset of like finding your true self, that so something like you mentioned, it's like a carrying of tradition. And so sometimes when you had a representation of people underneath the cross of Jesus, the people would wear at the clothes of that time that painting was drawn in, instead of what would be considered the historical accurate garb, right? So if a painting was painted of Christ on the cross, and there was the audience around it or something, and it was painting during, let's say, the 1300s, everybody would be wearing what would be worn around the 1300s, because it was viewed as a tradition that was passed on, that we were in a way almost all there, and there was something that kind of unites us. Whereas if you did that today, like I feel like if you painted an icon or something of the foot of the cross, and there was a bunch of people wearing like jeans and sneakers and hoodies and stuff like that of today's time, that almost feels like, it feels odd. Whereas if you look at paintings in the past, it doesn't feel as odd. Do you think that has something to do with like us separating ourselves from kind of that tradition, that it makes feel that, and not just in art specifically, but the way we even go about every day, the way we dress ourselves and everything else, so that when the artist tries to kind of like create this image and put it together, it just doesn't work? Does it make sense what I'm kind of getting at a little bit? Or
Yeah, I think that the idea of that sacred artists have always depicted figures in their artwork in contemporary clothing is a little bit of a truism that doesn't hold up under very close scrutiny for all as a generalization. I think if you look in the sort of early medieval art, you're talking about a time period when people didn't necessarily have a very strong historical sense in terms of the progression of material culture. And I don't know that the choice to like make the garments contemporary was a deliberate one, so much as that is simply what to their minds the garments looked like. You didn't necessarily have a culture of museums or of archaeological inquiry in which you would have been aware of the differences in material culture over time as much. And I think if you look at maybe the 13th century, you see a lot of garments that are sort of very simplified and seem almost timeless, like just a very like on angels in particularly, you would see the sort of these just flowing robes that don't really seem to belong to one period of time versus another. And then in the 14th and 15th centuries, suddenly you see much more contemporary looking details in terms of like, the shoes represent the fashion, and the weaponry, the armor, and such like that. And I think that is perhaps due to a couple of factors. One of which is that you had a thriving religious theater at the time, the miracle and mystery and morality plays, in which people would dress in what sort of clothing was available to them. And I think that this had an effect on visual artists who would paint and sculpt things as they saw them theatrically presented. And so in that era, suddenly you start seeing angels not wearing these sort of timeless flowing robes, but you have them in, dalmatics and chasubles, presumably because these sort of maybe older vestments that were not in consecrated use would be donated to the theatrical performers, or people would wear, people who were members of the craft guilds who typically perform those plays would wear their normal shoes, and so that's how the shoes would be drawn. Sometimes you even see, things like trapdoors and such showing up in, 15th century paintings. And then when you get into the humanists, they're not really doing contemporary clothing. They're kind of doing their imaginations of sort of an idealized sort of classical clothing. So I think it's a little more complicated than just saying people always did things in a way that was contemporary. In my own artwork, I have found it most useful to choose a particular setting, so to speak, for material culture. And in my case, that's mostly like late Middle Ages, in part because that's where I sort of think my aesthetic center is. That's where the artwork that I most admire comes from. And in part because it is, I find that when I draw a picture from the Old Testament that is in the style of, say, that has like the material culture of the 14th century being used in it, it is still possible for any casual viewer to look at it and recognize the things that I'm trying to communicate. If there's a man wearing a crown, you can say, okay, that's a king. Maybe that's King David. Whereas if I were to draw him, going to the archaeological journals and say, well, what would a king of the, so many thousands of years BC be wearing, and put that sort of crown on him? If people were to look at it, they would need a footnote to say, oh, that is a crown. And then they would have an extra step to understanding who is being depicted here. And by the same token, if I were to draw King David wearing like a tailored suit, because that's what the King of Spain wears nowadays, you would also require a footnote. You need an extra level of explanation for people to look at that and say, okay, this is a king, this is King David. And what I like about using the medieval material culture here is that I can do that for scenes of the Old Testament, for scenes of the New Testament, and for most of the saints whom I am interested in illustrating, which are typically ones of the early church through the Middle Ages. And so I can use a similar material culture for the vast majority of my drawings. The only real exceptions being if I'm asked to draw something that is specifically of a more recent time than that, or if it's a special commission that they want me to do something different. And that I've found as an artist is very useful in drawing connections between chronologically disparate events. Especially if I'm drawing a cycle of illustrations where it's like, okay, I'm drawing like a set of 70 or 200 pictures that illustrate various scenes from the Bible. And I want to emphasize, say, the theological connections between the sacrifice of Melchizedek and the sacrifice of Abel and the Last Supper, for example. I mean, we're talking about events separated by many thousands of years. Obviously, from an archaeological perspective, the clothing, the chalices, the tables, all that would look very different if you were trying to take an archaeological approach to the material culture. But if you give yourself permission to draw them all the same, then that can be used significantly. Because if you show similar looking vessels, you are telling your viewers these are similar events. You're giving people reason to see the connections rather than see the differences. And so I like to do that because it can unite, like I said, the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the lives of the saints into a single sort of setting. Now, do I think that's necessary or imperative on an artist? No. And do I think that an artist needs to choose the material culture of 15th century Northern Europe like I do? No, of course not. I mean, a different artist could make a different choice. But I see a real advantage to doing that. In some ways, I think it's a little similar to having something like a literary language or a liturgical language. Obviously, for many centuries, you would basically, in Western Christendom, you would translate everything into Latin if it's going to be used in prayer or worship. And that's regardless of whether it was written many thousands of years ago in Hebrew or a few thousand years ago in Greek, or if it was composed recently. And that, not having all these different languages together sort of, and having them be, translated into a common tongue makes it easier to draw connections between them. That's how I view my choice of material culture. It's sort of analogous to the choice of a particular language and style of language in order to unite these various time periods.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty interesting when you mentioned, like, even the crowns of that. Mm-hmm. There's certain imagery that comes more naturally to us, whereas there's other imagery that, like you described, there may need be like another descriptor or footnote or something in order to describe that. What is it about? I guess, what is it about some imagery that makes it so natural? And do you think that that's part of? Would you say that's maybe something along the lines of the medieval mind of just understanding almost the human spirit, where you almost don't have to leave footnotes? Like, what is kind of your? I know there's a lot of generalizations here and stuff like that, but I'm assuming that the fact that a lot of us haven't lived with kings, but to some extent, when we see like a golden, that golden kind of ornamented garment on someone's head, ornament on somebody's head, that there's something that speaks to us of like, oh, this person is either higher like important, or like a king or something along those lines that strikes us. Whereas once again, like you mentioned, if you see someone in a suit, like, you might think they're important, but then again, when you go to church, like sometimes you go to certain parishes, something, and everyone's wearing a suit, so it's almost like flattened. So I guess what are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I think in the artistic traditions that I admire and that I'm trying to continue, first off, I said they're very traditional, and part of that is part of what they do is they corroborate the patristic and liturgical traditions. And so sort of the same ideas that you have in the liturgy and that you have in the like the exegesis of the various church fathers are also communicated in the artwork. And part of what they do, the artists that I admire did, is try to make their artwork as beautiful as possible. But another thing that characterizes medieval art is that despite its very deep symbolic resonance, it can be very literal in its presentation. Sometimes to the point where it seems almost a little bit funny, because when you look at a medieval scene, a scene from medieval art, and try to identify what is this out of the Bible, it's like, well, if you know that there's a symbol there, sometimes you can identify the symbol and you can see the juxtapositions. But sometimes you just look at it and say, this is an artist trying to communicate what the text says in the most easy to grasp way possible. An example would be, I remember seeing once like a manuscript miniature, and it's something to do with the Exodus narrative, and the waves of the oceans that are in the background, the waves of the sea. It's like they're painted red, and it's like, oh well, is this a symbol? Is this referring to the plagues, to the blood-stained Nile emptying? It's like, and then you realize, no, this is just the Red Sea. He wants to say this is the Red Sea. Well, what color are you going to make the Red Sea? You're going to make it red, because you're just going to say, look, it's red, because that's the color that we're using to identify it. Simple things like that, and sometimes you see that in the gestures of the figures, where it's like, just it's almost, it follows a logic similar to what you would see in like a comic book page, because you have a very sort of limited vocabulary and limited space in which to communicate meaning and action. And the attitude, I think, of that time was, it's important to communicate the truths that are being depicted here as clearly as possible. And that is more important than, say, composing a picture so that it has the appearance of taking place within natural three-dimensional space, in which there is a single light source, and in which shadows fall analytically, and in which the diminution of the perceived size of objects is analytically determined based on their distance and such. You will see artists that will violate what would be considered standard practice in the Renaissance onward for showing light sources and shadows, or showing the vanishing points and the relative sizes of things, because the more important consideration is to communicate. And so, things will sometimes be depicted larger than they would appear in say, like a photograph, because they're more important, or smaller for that matter. So that's another aspect of this art that I think is it has great charm, but it also has great efficacy in communicating.
Is that something that attracted you to medieval art? What made you want to kind of carry on the tradition of it?
I don't think that I can explain that all rationally. I have had an attraction to the medieval style since I was a very young child. I know that when I was like 4 or 5, I remember I would watch the Sleeping Beauty movie, the Disney one, and I would sit there with paper and just be drawing heraldry and things along to the film. And I later learned that the artist responsible for all the background paintings in that movie was Ivan Earle, one of the great sort of 20th century medievalists, in my opinion, very strongly influenced by both Gothic and Persian art. In that case, mostly by Gothic and tapestries and panel paintings and illuminated manuscripts. My favorite children's books were ones that had sort of a stylistic influence from illuminated manuscripts. And when I encountered illuminated manuscripts for the first time, I was like, this is what I want to do. I don't know that I arrived at that through any sort of intellectual process, or if it just sort of struck me for one reason or another, whether that's you can explain that how you want. So it's something I don't know that I could really help. I think I've thought of reasons for it over the years as to why I love medieval art, why I think it has all these advantages, why I think it's the most worthy of revival and preservation. But on some level, it's simply just a part of who I am.
No, that's I'm the same way when someone asks me about why I went into filmmaking. I can't really describe it. I try to, my grandfather and stuff always had a big camera around, and I was maybe seeing that camera all the time when he was making home videos made me peaked in it, or maybe I just really like stories. I also can't point to why I chose that. For some reason I felt called to it. Another thing I kind of want to discuss in terms of, I guess, medieval art that I think is pretty interesting, it's seeing kind of a little bit how the East and the West over time separated, specifically with liturgical art, I guess, icons versus statuary developed, or even in style of looking at something like the humanist art versus a bunch of this imagery you have behind me. And so in iconography, there's this aspect of a lot of people say oh, I don't draw iconography, I write it, right? And even at first glance, this image right here may seem like it's just a portrait of Christ, but as you learn about it, you realize he's kind of split in two, where even his face, if you covered one end from the other, looks completely different. And then you realize that one end is judgment with the book and the other one is mercy. And there's like, there's meaning, and it kind of like calls you to, I guess, know the image behind you more in a more deeper sense, and a kind of like a call to prayer. Whereas you look at some imagery of something like, let's say, the Sistine Chapel, there's a lot more call to a little bit of like almost a celebration of the body, right? So you have like very muscular figures. You have the by the altar, the Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel, where everyone's like it's a lot of skin and muscle and bodies on top of each other. There's this kind of there's a separation, I guess, in the terms of like how art progressed. And so do you think, I guess the question is kind of what pieces of the medieval mind, I guess, called to each, I know this is kind of a big question, but like what called for one to kind of almost like be I would say almost like a more passionate response versus like something a little bit more analytical with the icons with that? Because when you look at general medieval art, I feel like there was a little, like, even if you look at Hildegard von Bingen's imagery of her visions or something like that, there's like a little bit of both in there, where there's this symbolic imagery and then there's also a little bit of like this passion coming out of that. So I don't know if you have kind of like thoughts on that, or like,
Yeah, no, this is kind of a big subject here, the relation between the Eastern and the Western church art. I have some pretty I have a lot of opinions about it. I think that there's a lot of misconceptions when people categorize different styles of Western art, in that, first off, you have to make a distinction between the medieval art and sort of the humanist art and the Baroque art that follows. And so I'm not going to talk about the latter right now. But when it comes to something like Gothic art, which is what people would associate with the art that's the dominant style in Western Christendom from, say, the mid-12th up through about the 15th century or 16th, depending on where you are. I think of that very much as a sibling art to Byzantine iconography. I believe that they come from the same sources. Ultimately, they had very different sort of paths of development. But I think that they are both, could both be described as iconographic, in the sense that they have a symbolic order that corroborates liturgical and patristic sources, and that ultimately is derived from the same tradition. I think that among Roman Catholics, there's sometimes a tendency just to emphasize the progression of styles and see that as something that is characteristically Western, which I don't think is quite accurate. I think there's a tendency among Catholics we sort of feel like we have to start and end every conversation with a Pope quote, and I'm sort of notoriously resistant to using Pope quotes. And the thing is that when it comes to the subject of sacred art, there aren't a whole lot of really good ones. And so people tend to use the same ones over and over again. It's like, okay, well, here's the one from John Paul II's letter to artists, and here's one from the Spirit of the Liturgy. And I mean, Ratzinger obviously is a very brilliant theologian, but I think his sort of system of categorization that he puts forth in the Spirit of the Liturgy is, I think, a little bit overused by people who just sort of feel they have to have some papal quotes involved in the discussion, where he makes this sort of distinction between, like, oh, here's the iconographic style, here's the Gothic style, and here's the Baroque style, and here's what's good about each of them, and here's what's different about each of them. And I mean, that all has some merit, but I think when you think that way, it tends to emphasize the idea that iconography and Gothic art are two separate and contrary things, which is something that a lot of Eastern Christians will be happy to say, and because they want to think of iconography as being, superior. But I think that I don't really think that these are two contrary traditions. I think, like I said, I think they are sibling traditions. And if you want to have my sort of how I would summarize the development of those in a very, very quick and cursory way, I'll give it, which is that you had certain traditions of art that emerged early on in the church, some of which were favored in the sort of, the more in the Holy Land, some of which were more favored in the Greek-speaking communities that drew more inspiration from classical art. And this was all sort of during the centuries of persecution, and so, some of it was done clandestinely, some of it was, a lot of it was destroyed. We don't have a great archaeological record. I certainly take it as a matter of faith that this is a tradition that stretches back to the apostles, that of Christian art is a tradition that stretches back to the apostles. We don't really have enough surviving evidence to prove that archaeologically, but I believe it's true. And I think that was the conviction of most Christians throughout history. And so you have a few different sort of emerging systems of symbolism. And in the Byzantine Empire, after the legalization of Christianity and the beginning of the construction of monumental churches, they kind of merged together into a unified system. And we don't know a whole lot about that either, because there were two iconoclastic crises, one in the 8th century and one in the 9th, that wiped out a lot of the sacred artwork from those early centuries. So again, we have an incomplete record. I mean, obviously there are a few caches of pre-iconoclastic icons, like the Sinai Pantocrator that you just pointed to is one of them, but there's not a whole lot. And after something like the iconoclastic crises, when you reconstruct the tradition, if you're given that task, you're going to do it in a somewhat more orderly fashion. For example, like I've lived many years in Chicago, and like in Chicago, it's very easy to navigate. The streets are almost all orthogonal. You can identify location just by, numerical coordinates. I'm like, oh, I'm at 2100 North or whatever. Because if a city burns down and you rebuild it, you're going to rebuild it in a way that makes a lot of sense. You're not going to recreate every sort of cow path or whatever that wound up becoming a street. And so I think Byzantine iconography in the aftermath of the iconoclastic crises became a more precisely defined system with more, more rigidly followed rules. Now, in the West, you had a different process because the iconoclastic crisis didn't happen, but for the most part of the early Middle Ages, it was mission territory. And so you had missionaries coming from the major metropolitan centers of Christianity, places like, Byzantium or Ephesus or, Alexandria, and going and founding monasteries in, Northern and Western Europe. And so, well, how do you transmit iconographic and artistic traditions over those distances? Well, some of it you can do by memory. Sure, but more effective is you have examples, and the examples that you're going to carry with you are going to be ones that are portable. And so you're not necessarily going to see large mosaics and, that are adorning a basilica have as much of an influence in transmitting those traditions as you are things that you can carry with you, like, say, a holy water bottle with a metalworked scene on the front that recreates that mosaic, or a little ivory diptych, or something in fabric that you can fold up, or especially a book, because a manuscript, could have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pictures in it. And so you might have a missionary who travels, who buys a certain set of, he buys a few psalters and a missal and, a few other books in Rome or wherever, and he goes and he founds a monastery in, Ireland, say. And the illustrations in those books sort of become that's the sort of the original source for the artistic tradition that grows up within that monastery and its scriptorium and all the artists who live there. Because until the 12th century, sacred art is still mostly a monastic endeavor. You might have a different monastery 100 miles away whose founder bought a completely different set of books that had been originally made in, say, Ephesus or Alexandria or somewhere else. And so that monastery, which is geographically not that far away, could have a different uh, uh, a different variety of iconography made, because the books and the artwork that were taken there originally were from a different source. And so you have this all across Western and Northern Europe, where you can spot like little bits of, this is Syrian iconography showing up here in Spain, and then in this right down the road you have the Greek expression of this, and it's kind of fascinating to trace this as much as you can, and assuming it's mostly done through books and small portable works of art. I think it comes from the same sources that ultimately merged into Byzantine art. Now, it doesn't become kind of a unified system in the West until the emergence of the Gothic style, which is a bit of a misnomer, but I mean, this happens kind of around the middle of the 12th century, at a time in which the intellectual climate was one in which people really were thinking about taking an encyclopedic approach to Christian tradition. Obviously, 100 years later, like Thomas Aquinas is like a major figure of the the theological aspect of that, but the artistic aspect of that happens when you start building the Gothic cathedrals in mid 12th century, and that's when all these disparate little traditions kind of get unified in the West. And so, even though it's a style that emerges later than Byzantine art, I think it comes from the same sources, and I think it has, in some ways, the same venerable pedigree. There are obviously ways in which it also departed from the Byzantine practice, and I think that a lot of Eastern Christians would say that these are extremely important. I don't necessarily think they are. I could tell you what some of those are, but I should let you get a word in first.
No, I'm glad. What's it called? I'm glad you said what you said, because I mean, in general, I agree with you with the Gothic, what you were mentioning with the Gothic tradition and stuff like that. It's pretty interesting. I read an article last year from a Ukrainian Catholic priest talking about the Dormition and seeing a lot of the Gothic artwork at that time also portraying the Dormition basically in the same manner, except with obviously more of a Gothic style versus the Byzantine style. But it was like the same image. It was Our Lady in the forefront, laying there with the apostles around her, and Christ with the child like behind her and stuff like that. And so, to your point, you can see that it was the same, in a way, the same thing that was driving both of the artworks, because you can see it, but eventually like this, they were just kind of like stylistically they might have differed, but like the meaning and everything behind it was all there and the same. And for me, the reason I asked that question is because sometimes I see, I see just in general, like when it just the same way, like you laughed, like every person kind of starts with a Pope quote or something like that. I feel like there's a lot of speakers or well-known Catholics and stuff that always refer to like an image in the Sistine Chapel, or like during that humanistic time, in order to make a point. So it's to kind of continue with the joke, it's almost like you start with a papal Pope quote, and then you refer to something in the Sistine Chapel, and then you kind of go on with it. And so I just in general think, as I'm learning these things and like interested in drawing, I've been way more drawn to like the medieval view of cosmology, how they approached art and everything else, versus how the modern world has kind of like evolved it to this kind of androgynous thing that kind of like doesn't mean anything, but if you say out loud it doesn't mean anything, then it hurts somebody's feelings because it does mean something in a sense, right? There's this like weird play where it can be anything, but because it can be anything, it means that it means so much, but at the same time it doesn't mean anything. And so that's why I guess in a way sometimes I recognize the Gothic thing, but I almost like look past it, because it feels like, when I listen to other people speak on it, they almost look past the Gothic period and they go straight towards like the humanist era. And so like that's where kind of like, I guess the question came from a little bit to that in that sense. How do you, do you think how does I feel like the people, and you might disagree with me on this, but I feel so the kind of the next kind of follow up to this whole thing that I want to quickly mention in one way is I think I sometimes feel that people have this false view of tradition being something more of like a rock that just like stays a rock forever, where I almost view tradition more something of a body where there is change in it, but it's very slight. It's almost like a breathing in and out, right? Like your body changes with breath in a way. And so it allows, there's a sense of evolution in that tradition, but in the same weird way, you never lose where it came from, if that makes sense. And so how can medieval art kind of continue to evolve in the modern world without being too, I guess, like stiff, where it's just like, you know, you can argue like maybe the East does this, where it's like it never changes from this, versus allowing it to be something that can speak to the modern era as well.
Well, I think the metaphor of the body is a good one, and that's one that was used by Vincent de Lorentz in his the Commonitorium is like one of the most well-known patristic commentaries on the idea of tradition and its development, and he compares the development of tradition to the development of a body, in that he does not view it as a matter of staying the same, but of having the same components in infancy as it has in maturity. And so a body changes over time, and sometimes in ways that are very dramatic, and sometimes in ways that are kind of rapid, but it doesn't develop organs that weren't there to begin with. And it doesn't lose the ones that were there to begin with unless it's through like injury. And so that metaphor I really like, because it doesn't make it dependent on slowness. I don't think that a development is organic or legitimate just because it happens slowly, and I don't think it's illegitimate or inorganic just because it happens quickly. I think that if you look at the story of medieval art, there are periods in which it undergoes a very rapid development in ways that I still believe maintain the tradition. You know, I mentioned, you know, the beginning of the construction of monumental churches in under the patronage of Saint Helena. You know, that time was a very, very rapidly developing practice. That was a time of rapid development that could be considered comparable to like toddlerhood, when you know you go from a baby to a toddler to a little kid so quickly, and so much changes. I mean, it's still the same kid, but you know, it changes quickly. And I think that you could say the same thing about the 12th century. You know, going from, you look at artwork and architecture and in any really medium, really, and look at the sophistication in the work from around 1100 to around 1300, and it's a huge leap in sophistication. And I think that's something that you could say, well, that's maybe comparable to adolescence. You know, people change very quickly, but they're still themselves. And I'm mostly interested in like 15th century art, which is a bit unusual. Most medievalists like a little earlier, but I mean, that time period saw some really remarkable changes just because of technology. I mean, you had at one point you didn't have oil paint, and then it was invented, and then suddenly you have this whole new medium for painting that you did not have before. You have the invention of the Gutenberg press. You have the invention of etching. Like chemical etching. You have things that just didn't exist before, and suddenly they do, and you can do all sorts of things with them. And the artist didn't say, "Oh, well, that we didn't have that 100 years ago, so I better not use it." I mean, they saw the possibilities of doing something wonderful with it. And so I think the important thing for artists to bear in mind who want to make religious art is that you can't ever view religious art as a finished task, as something that was done as well as it could ever be done. Because ultimately its ideal is not any historical artifact. Its ideal is, paradisical. Its ideal is above us. I like to quote Hildegard, whom you've mentioned, in that she wrote a famous epistle to the prelates of Mainz who had forbidden her nuns from singing. And so she used this as an opportunity to explain sort of a theology of sacred music, which I think can be applied to really all art, in which she said that beauty appeals to us, I'm paraphrasing obviously, because it reminds us of this sort of dim memory of the Garden of Eden. That music reminds us of the voice of Adam, that before his fall was so beautiful, like none of us could stand it in a fallen state. But that is why we make music, is because we're trying to get back to that state of beatitude and that original beauty, and that sense is still within us. And I think that that's why beautiful forms resonate with us. And if you believe that the Garden of Eden is one of the two foci around which we're orbiting as religious artists, then you know that you're never going to get there and say, this is a done task, this is finished. And so I understand why people will try to set up a historical example as an ideal, and it's because they are reacting against an abundance of bad art. And they're thinking practically, and they want to say, well, we don't want bad art, which we view as a more modern phenomenon. So let's say, depending on who you are, you might say, we'll say everything should be done in the style of 13th century Gothic, or everything should be done in the style of Andrei Rublev, or everything should be done in the style of Gregorian chant. And I think that as much as those sort of attitudes come from a place of, love and goodwill, I don't really think they're satisfying as a guide for artists, because any earthly work of art, no matter how good it is merely the unrealized form of something better that we are aspiring to hear and see in heaven. And so that is how we need to view our very favorite works of art, as things that are not yet as good as they ought to be. And our very favorite traditions are things that are not yet taken to the place where they are going. And so that is what I want to take to medieval art. Now, that's not to say that I think that I personally can outdo all of my favorite artists. I mean, many of them have achieved a level of skill and insight that I don't expect ever to attain in my lifetime. But I think that as part of a collective effort to continue their work, you have to think that there are ways in which it could be improved, and actually have that in mind when you're making your own artwork.
Yeah, I really, what's it called? I feel like I do that sometimes, where I have like this ideal of like this time period had art right, and we should kind of go back to that. And I think it is a little bit of what I've been mentioning before, is of escaping this modern hellscape of this kind of like, saying that just like art has become the niche of art has to be like almost unique, right? It's like it's a shock factor, like doing something no one else has done before. And I think it's nice sometimes to, instead of trying to like shock people all the time, to have something passed down to you and kind of continue that mold, so to speak, and kind of continue to develop it a little bit. So last question I have is just how, when you create this art, do you gain inspiration? You kind of start doing something? Does it come from commissions? Is it both? How do you know when you decide when you start working on something?
The majority of drawings I make are on commission. And I'm very fortunate in that I have a lot of commissioned work, and so that keeps me pretty busy. I'm usually booked out for 6 months to a year ahead. There are works that I want to do on speculation that I think of the concepts on my own, and those I fit them in when I can. A large project I've been working on for a few years now is called the Sumula Pictoria, which is like a cycle of illustrations of biblical scenes. probably like 240 or so is what I ultimately hope to produce, and I've not made as many of them as I would like to have, because things go slower than I plan. That's just the nature of life. But this is sort of a hybrid between a commission and speculation work, in that I'm sort of proposing the subjects, and then I'm asking patrons, are you interested in sponsoring these? And so I'm getting people who are, paying for the drawings, but I'm kind of deciding what I'm depicting. And I started that project because, after the first 10 or so years of my professional career, and that's as a full-time professional, I found that there were just certain subjects that never got commissioned, and that included the vast majority of the Old Testament. I get lots of commissions for, patron saints, because people want them for, baptisms and, confirmation gifts, ordinations, things like that. Plenty of commissions for some of the more popular scenes from the gospel, like, the crucifixion, annunciation, but, I've never drawn Jacob's ladder and something like that. So these like Old Testament scenes were just not. I realized that if I didn't do something about it, I would end my artistic career without ever having drawn a lot of what I think are the most interesting subjects in Christian iconography. And so that is a project that I decided on the content and went to look for the patronage. Aside from that, I can't really help where my creativity goes. Sometimes I just get an idea and I kind of have to follow it in whatever spare time I have. Sometimes my mind gets stuck on like lettering, and I feel that I have to design a typeface or work on some calligraphy, even if I don't think that it's going to be the most lucrative use of my time. I've been really into writing poetry lately, which is sort of a side project which does not pay the bills in the way that drawing does, but I mean, very often I'm more intellectually engaged with that, and I can't really help it, I don't think. So yeah, I don't really know. I don't know that I can explain why I'm drawn to particular things at any particular time, but the commissions do tend to drive a lot of what I do.
Great. Yeah, I've been into poetry as well. I'm actually in the process of I'm trying to get my stuff in order, and I'm trying to kind of write an epic poem of the modern age, in a sense, like kind of almost like a Beowulf style thing. But it's tough to when you're doing something like that. At least for me, it's tough to kind of balance a rhythm and stuff while also driving the story forward in a way so that it's like both meets. But yeah, I appreciate you stopping by again. And once again, if anyone's interested in checking out Daniel's work, you can go to the website, danielmitsui.com, and I will also have it in the description below. And is there anything else that you have on your mind, or kind of like want to close us out with, or?
There was a quote that was on my mind that I thought I might have opportunity to bring up, which we didn't, which was, it's something I like to say from Arthur Penty, which is, he said, there's a right way of doing everything, and that right way is art. And I think that no matter what you're doing as an artist, no matter what style you're working in, no matter what, genre you're working in, that really that conviction that you're trying to do something the right way is, characterizes most artists who make work that's really worthwhile. And so to anybody who is making art, I mean, whether you agree or disagree with anything I've said, or conceptually or religiously or whatever, I mean, I hope that you undertake what you're doing with love and with the desire to do it right. So I'll say that to end.
Thank you. Except if you're an AI artist.
Yeah, there's no such thing. You know that.
Yeah. All right.
If you're a round square, then I don't care what you think.